Today we're talking about video frame rates, which you should be using and when you should be using them to take your movie making skills to the next level. And we're starting right now. If you're just getting started in filmmaking, one of the technical camera, let's call them things that you might find intimidating, is the choice of frame rates that your camera has to offer. Why do you have such a choice? What do all the different ones mean? And what does choosing one specifically do to the final look of your video? So let's break this down. Frame rate, or that's frames per second, is how many still images or frames your camera is capturing per second. The ones you find in your camera or smartphone are usually either 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, or in newer models, even 240 frames per second. Although these higher options aren't always available in the highest definitions, at least not yet. These rates can be split into two categories. Ones that shoot at what we define as standard video, that's 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, and ones that shoot at higher than standard frame rates, or unstandard frame rates if you like made up words. That's all the rest. So what's the difference and why choose one over all the others? Let's have a look at them all individually to find out, starting with the standard video frame rates and the granddaddy of them all, 24 frames per second. 24 is what every single brilliant, beautiful, magnificent, insert your own platitude here, cinematic film you've ever seen is shot on. Unless of course we're talking about The Hobbit, which was shot at like frames per second. But then again, if you're watching this and thinking The Hobbit is a cinematic masterpiece, you may be on the wrong channel. Why is 24 frames per second the gold standard of filmmaking? Well, it's because it's a classic. It never gets old. When movies were invented and shown over a century ago, hand-cranked projectors, because people liked to be steampunky back then, worked between 16 frames per second and 26 frames per second. The reason being is that it took this many images per second to fool the eyes of the audience into thinking they were watching true motion. But as cinema became the next big thing, it was agreed that there needed to be some kind of standardization. And so 24 frames per second became that gold standard. Balanced realistic motion with the affordability of film stock, which was quite expensive. And because for a century everybody has grown up watching movies projected at 24 frames per second, it's lodged in our brains that this is what cinema should look like, and anything else just feels a little bit okay, but if this was entirely true, you might be thinking, then why do we need other frame rate options? Well, variety is often born out of necessity, although that isn't actually the quote, and that's exactly what happened here. The invention of television brought with it, well, really naff televisions, in which the resolution was so low, it was decided in the United States for anything to look like passable motion, a new standard was going to need to be set, and that standard was going to be 30 frames per second. And again, it stuck around with us for a very long while, at least until the birth of high definition digital video cameras in the noughties. The difference over the years in what 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second look like is that 30 frames per second often look rather cheap. But this is also because film was mostly shot on film at 24 frames per second and TV was shot on tape at 30 frames per second. Tape was cheaper than film and could be recorded over, meaning it was reusable. And this was much better suited for the ongoing demand of network TV, with programs needing to be recorded all the time again and again, like daily soap operas. But today, we all use digital cameras with roughly the same tech. And so the difference between 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second is now almost negligible. Almost. And it's just that cinematic conditioning that makes 24 frames per second far more endearing than its ugly little snotty-nosed brother, 30 frames per second. So what are the higher frame rates? 60, 120 and 240 frames per second allow us to capture fast-moving moments in slow motion. When action is moving faster than what 24 frames per second can capture, then these frame rates are your best friends. The higher the frame rate, the more that can be captured in the shortest space of time, making for smoother and ultimately more elegant looking video. But hang on, if cinematic elegance is what we're after, why don't we just shoot at a higher frame rate all the time? Because we still have the mindset doubting Paul that 24 frames per second is the most cinematic look. And if you thought 30 frames per second looked kind of cheap, wait till you see these higher frame rates played at real-time speed. Everything starts to look a little too sharp, a little too real, and ultimately less cinematic. So when should you use these higher frame rates? Well, it all kind of depends on what it is you want to shoot and the look you want to achieve. For instance, if you wanted to capture a single moment with more drama, just a split second, shooting at a higher frame rate to capture it more vividly in slow motion may well help tell your story with more visual texture. But they're also great to use if you think you're going to capture something that might be missed at 24 frames per second. Like if you're shooting a documentary and you've only got one chance to capture a certain event, like a sports match or a dance competition or a sports match. Okay, but when do you decide which of the higher frame rates to use? Good point questioning, Paul. This comes down to the speed and nature of what it is you want to shoot. The faster or more subtle the movement to the human eye, the higher the frame rate you want to be shooting at. Although be warned, having such choice can lead to speed regret, or SPREGRET, as I've just defined it. This is where you can't decide whether you should be shooting something at 24 frames per second or at a higher frame rate, leading you to decide on shooting everything twice, causing everybody on your film set to get very bored at your lack of decision making. A better way to tackle this issue is to plan ahead of time. It's going to make everybody on your film set think you know what you're doing. So now I know when to use the higher frame rates. How often should I use them? Well, not as much as you think. Second question, Paul. Use the higher frame rates sparingly, as nobody really wants to watch an entire movie in slow motion. The rule of thumb here, and this is something you can work out in the editing process, is once you think the audience realises they're watching something in slow motion, it's probably time to cut back to something at 24 frames per second. Speaking of which, it's good to remember that whilst we now have these tools to shoot things at higher frame rates and get more elegant slow motion footage, we survived in a filmmaking world without these tools for almost 100 years. So if you find yourself backed into a corner or in a push, remember that 24 frames per second is always going to be the go-to choice to get something that looks cinematic. But it isn't just frame rates or even the camera you're using that can give you that final filmic look. In fact, if you click on this video here, it'll show you a bunch of other things, again, technical term, to give you that cinematic finish no matter what camera you're using. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, filmmaker.